you doing, folks? Welcome to the fifth video of the series I Am Not Protestant. How you doing, Richard?
I'm just as good as I was the first time we filmed this.
Very good. So, nothing more propitious for us to talk about than the Eucharist, since April is the month the Church, the Catholic Church, celebrates and remembers and reminds us about the importance of the Eucharist. But we should start with some of the objections, and obviously the biggest misconception that Protestants have around the Eucharist is see that as a mere symbolism. Because how can the bread be transformed to the sense that Catholics believe that is actually the body of Christ, the Son of God?
Well, if we're talking about the physical properties of it, one of the reasons why we believe, for example, it is truly the flesh and blood of Christ, it is under the veiled appearance of bread and wine, is for the sake of our delicate faculties. If it appeared as it truly is, a hunk of flesh and a cup of blood, it would be very difficult for people to engage with that. So it is, the strict reason for it is for our sensibilities. But as many have discussed before, the whole fact of devouring the flesh, drinking the blood was a difficulty for many. Even when Christ first preached about it, many left him on account of this hard teaching. It's a difficult thing to imagine. It was difficult for the Greeks, it was difficult for the Romans, it was difficult for the disbelieving Jews, because it is such a surprising thing. So you eat the flesh and drink the blood, and you shall have no life within you. It is a natural fallen inclination to believe, you must eat his word, you must eat the Bible and drink the spirit of it, and then you shall have life in you, as some Protestants preach. But this is not true. It is a physical eating and a drinking, which we see prefigured most strongly with the manna from heaven that rained on Moses and the Israelites. Every morning they were to go out and they were to gather this strange heavenly bread that materialized, and they were to eat it all in one sitting, and they weren't to save any for the next day, which is incidentally exactly what we do when bread is consecrated and transformed into the flesh of God. We eat it, and we do not take it home, we do not hoard it. It is the same thing. It is not merely a spiritual truth, although there is an element of that. It is not merely a wisdom, it is a physical food that we eat. And of course, when Christ is talking about eating the flesh and drinking the blood, he's not, talking about delicately nibbling on. The Greek word for it is to gnaw. It is a rending, pulling of meat. It is a violent sort of action. Part, of course, his desire and his willingness to suffer is that he condescends to us. He says, I will allow you to eat on my very flesh because there is no other means for you to be saved. And he has done that for us. We see it prefigured in the Old Testament. We see it actually performed in the New Testament. And many abandon him because of it. And they continue to abandon him in this own day. People refusing to follow it. And it's not difficult to imagine why. But of course, we are consoled by many miracles about this. For example, the most famous is Lanciano, the town in Italy, most named as such because it is, according to sacred tradition, the town which the centurion who stabbed Christ in the side originally came from. Hence it becomes Lanciano, town of the lance, where there is a piece of flesh in a monstrance, because we've had many times in church history a priest privately doubts that the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ, and at the elevation it is transformed physically, or rather it is always transformed physically, but it is revealed to be what it truly is, into a hunk of raw flesh. And of course, all of these samples all match. They are all cardiac muscle. It is the piece of Christ's heart. Incidentally, the Sacred Heart is, I believe, most accurate and most wonderful as a devotion, because it reflects that of the flesh that Christ gives of us to eat, it is of his heart, that where his generosity, his love, his charity coming from the heart, that is the flesh that we eat upon. And it has always been reported by scientists who have been allowed to study it. The flesh is alive, even hundreds of years later. The blood has not, the cells haven't exploded. It is all of a person of Middle Eastern descent, a man suffering great pain, because, of course, any butcher can tell you if an animal is slain in the moment of its agony, you taste it in the flesh. And the same can be said of our Lord, who died in the uttermost agony. So it is present, that pain, that loving agony is present in his flesh and his blood, given out for us to attain the forgiveness of our sins. And so we engage in that most fully when we actually eat his flesh and drink his blood. And this is why Christ mandated us to do so, because it is the greatest salvific command Christ has given us. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you shall have no life.
Let's talk about the moment in Mass where the priest starts the Eucharistic prayers. What happens?
Well, we have bread and wine are, of course, brought forth. They are placed on the altar, and we have the ceremony, which in the Latin rite and in the Novus Ordo rite, the fundamental action is the same, the prayers are different, but essentially it fundamentally recreates the Last Supper in the upper room, where the priest speaking over the host, in hoc est enim corpus, this is my body which will be given up for you. And he elevates the host much as Christ raised his body up on the cross. And that is the moment when it is held up for all to see that it becomes the true flesh. It is no longer merely bread, it is the flesh. And in the priest continues in a similar way, when supper was ended, giving thanks, he took forth the cup, blessed and gave it to his disciples, and said, take this all of you and drink from it. This is the chalice of my blood, the blood of the new and everlasting covenant, which will be poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in memory of me. And he raises the chalice, the same thing happens. And he says, Mysterium Fidei, the mystery of faith. We proclaim your death, O Lord, and profess your resurrection until you come again. And this, the love feast, is the true thing that unites Catholics. There's the Pope, and that's a very important individual. But to be in communion with each other as Catholics individually, or in communion as the Church, we share in the same meal. And that meal is body and blood of Christ, which is why when schisms happen, we do not co-celebrate with, for example, the Greeks or the Russians or the Egyptians or the Assyrians, nor they with us. Because, think about it, you would not sit down to a dinner usually with someone who you really hate. You sit down to eat with those you love, with those who you are charitable towards. And if somebody refuses to come to a celebration with you, you take great insult. It hurts you because they do not want fellowship with you. The same thing is with the Church, because this eating of the flesh of Christ is a prefigurement of the marriage feast in heaven, which is the eternal Mass, because every Mass and the consumption of the Eucharist is a little joining into the continual heavenly experience. We dip in and we dip out while we're at Mass, but it's an eternal moment. And ultimately in heaven, we will be enjoying that moment in Mass of the consecration stretched unto ages of ages. And there's always almost a perfect silence. In the East, there is a more celebratory atmosphere. There's a lot of bells and there's a lot more noise, and that has its interesting reasons as well. But I think of it this way, for Protestants, it is not merely the Catholics who believe in this. It is the Orthodox and the Copts and the Nestorians. And they all practice their local variants of the same thing, the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, the Alexandrine Rite, the Syriac Rite, all these sorts of things. And regardless of the lack of communion, they nevertheless believe in the Eucharist. We do not have substantial doubt about it until the 1600s. And even then, many Lutherans and many Anglicans have a much more ostensibly Catholic opinion of it than you would say more radical Baptists, who dispense with it entirely, or believe that you can take a loaf of Hovis and a glass of Ribena and functionally do the same thing, which I have heard of. This is utterly alien to the Christian experience, all the way up until, let's say, the Anabaptists in Germany. We just do not see it at any time. So to participate in the Eucharist is the ultimate form of Christian worship. The Mass, which we have discussed, it's not really a Mass without the Eucharist. That is so essential. The preaching of the gospel is good and it is necessary, but it is the Eucharist which is what defines it as a holy space. because repeating the words of the Gospels is good, but in the celebration of the Eucharist, God himself deigns, he humiliates himself to come down to bread and wine, the work of human hands, and appears in them and takes over them, much as if he did when he was incarnated on earth, and allows himself to be eaten and drank by us, people who have betrayed him many times in the past and likely will do so again. That is an act of humility only possible through Christ. Christ is the only person, fully God and fully man, who could submit himself to such a perfect degree because he loves us and there is no better way to save us.
Can anyone celebrate the Eucharist?
Depends what you mean by celebrate.
Can anyone consecrate the Eucharist?
Only priests and bishops.
Can anyone receive the Eucharist?
Those who are in a state of grace and are in full membership in the Catholic Church can receive. If you are not in a state of grace, you cannot, because as the Bible itself says, you eat and drink unto damnation, unto condemnation. Because only those who have cleansed themselves through the ritual and through the grace of confession can eat the flesh of Christ without incurring more debt upon themselves. And this was always the belief. In the East, it's even more rigorous with the fasting. And we, for example, the canonical rules, you have to fast 1 hour. Previously and traditionally, it's from the night before, from midnight the night before. St. Thomas Aquinas talks about that. To abstain from marital relations on the day of receiving the Eucharist and so forth. To be more purified than you would be any other state. You have to attain as much purity as possible because you are literally eating the flesh of God. And what could be more significant an event than that?
That's very good that you say that you need to be in a state of grace to receive the Eucharist, because this is not very widely spoken nowadays.
No, it's not very widely believed either.
Some Francis of Sales would say only 2 people can go and receive Jesus in the Eucharist, in the Blessed Sacrament. The perfect to become more perfect, and the imperfect to become perfect. Mm-hmm. But when he talks about the imperfect, he's not talking about them in mortal sin like we see nowadays.
People in venial sin, people who've made a smaller non-mortal sins, and we could talk about the distinction of that. It's in some of the series and some of the video, but there are, of course, there are sins which kill the relationship with Christ, and those that damage it. And for those who are damaged and wounded, and who among us is not, it is a remedy for the sick. It is food for the sick to strengthen them. And for those who have been perfected, even if only temporarily, because of our fallen nature, but those who go to confession and receive a penance and perform the penance and go up made fearsome and terrifying to the devil, they receive the body and blood and go away terrifying to the demons. It is the greatest experience that one could have in this life, above and beyond anything else. Thousands of years, the Hebrew people lived and died waiting for something like this. And we have it in every church, every day, and many of us, including myself, think, oh, I won't go today. It's a Wednesday. I can get it on Sunday. It's a miracle happening every day all over the world. If we were really tuned in, we would be engaging with it more, because we should recognize that our forebears had to make do with, the blood of bulls and the sacrifice of mere animals on the altar. But we have God, his own Son, sacrificed on the altar for us to eat and to drink so that we may live forever.
Saint Philippe Neri would say a phrase that for a long time inspired me. The devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary and to the Blessed Sacrament are not the best, but the only way for young people to keep their purity. Without the Eucharist, there can be no chastity. And what is the place that the Eucharist have in the Catholic Church?
Central. It is. One couldn't talk enough about it. Without the Eucharist, what are we? I mean, the 7 sacraments, 7 being, of course, the perfect number, the number of completion. You pull any one of them out, the whole structure falls apart. But without the Eucharist, even more so than confession, we would not have salvation. It would be impossible. Christ it's impossible to even envisage, as a Catholic, Christ's mission on earth without the inclusion of the Eucharist. It's simply impossible. It's incomplete somehow. Moses and the Israelites would have died in the desert without the manna. They would not have survived to reach the promised land. And neither will we. We will perish and weaken and die if we do not have the Eucharist. And the same has been seen time and time again with various sects and false churches and schismatic organizations that you can only find out on a Wikipedia dive at 2 o'clock in the morning. You would never have known that these people gave their whole lives towards lies because they petered out. They faded away because they didn't have the Eucharist. They didn't have a legitimate priesthood. They didn't have the sacraments. They did not have God's grace within them. We here, Catholic Church, have endured these incredibly difficult millennia because we are fed and watered on the body and blood of Christ, which is the only thing that we could possibly have to survive this long. And it's been said that if the angels could envy us anything, they would envy us the Eucharist, because they, being spirit and not flesh, cannot partake by eating and drinking. So even the mighty angels look upon us and think, in some sense, if only we could have that. What a glory it would be. But we have it. It is our privilege to have it. Why will we refuse it? Why would we doubt it? Even the seraphim who see God in the face, they probably would wish to eat it, body and blood, if they could.
That's amazing that you spoke about we spoke only about Lanciano, but there's many.
It's the biggest example, but there are
Eucharistic
so many more
miracles around the world throughout history. But also, as one thing that we have in the Catholic Church that's called incorruptible bodies of people, and that is attributed to Catholics who have received the Eucharist. That's why their bodies remain incorruptible until this day. Do you know any of Protestant bodies that still are incorrupt?
Even with all the Botox in the world, I don't think so.
That's something to think about.
Something to think about. Because God is not a God of the dead, but of the living. And despite the genuinely catchy Protestant hymn of them bones, they gonna walk around, well, we have incorruptible saints, and the Protestants don't. And one can throw all of the doubts of, this, that, and the other injections, they embalmed them. No. It happens too often, and it's been going on for too long to have any kind of chicanery going on around that. And
I think the number is 2,000.
Something like that, which is a good number. That's a healthy number. Even if we were to round down a couple, if there were a couple of suspicious articles in there, 2,000, that's a lot.
Very good.
The United Nations couldn't keep that scam going.
Unbelievable. So the Eucharist is one of the 7 sacraments of the Church. What are we going to be talking next?
I believe we're going to be talking about the sacramentals or confession. I don't know. It's been a long week.
We can talk about the confession instance.